Good evening, and welcome to another of our series of webinars. Before I introduce this evening's guest, a few words. Today we mark 85 years since Kristallnacht, an event that truly announced the horrors of the genocidal intentions of the Nazis. This past month, we have been reeling from the horrific acts of Hamas against innocent Jews and Israeli civilians. Since October 7th, we at StandWithUs have pushed ourselves to serve the community to enhance Israeli voices and fight against anti-Semitism in this country. In the last month, you can see we have reached thousands of people in person, millions on social media. We thank you all for joining our efforts in supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism. And we will continue to serve you in this manner for the future. Last Thursday, we had a successful event at the House of Lords to launch our newest booklet, The UK-Israel, A Relationship of Shared Values, which looks at the history of the British Jewish community and the subsequent relationship between Israel until present day. We continue to empower our community at all ages through education. You can find this and all of our literature on our website, www.standwithus.com/UK, or you can also scan the QR code on the screen behind me during this webinar. If you wish to invite a Stand With Us educator to your school, youth group, university, short, or community event, then please contact us at uk@standwithus.com. Contact details are here behind me on the screen. Tonight, we turn our attentions to questions about international law, ceasefires, and the United Nations. Many people seem to suggest that they've become sort of experts talking about international law. We felt that we would actually speak to an actual expert to discuss these issues with. Rosa Freedman is the inaugural Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading. She received her LLB, LLM and PhD from the University of London and is a non-practicing barrister and member of the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. Rosa's research focuses on the UN and human rights. She has published extensively on UN human rights bodies and systems and on UN peacekeeping and accountability for human rights abuses. Her published work includes 3 monographs, 2 co-edited collections, and articles in American Journal of International Law, European Journal of International Law, Leiden Journal of International Law, and Human Rights Quarterly. Amongst others, she is a visiting fellow at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Rosa is a member of the UN Secretary General's Civil Society Advisory Board of Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, is a specialist advisor on safeguarding to the UK Government International Development Committee, and sits on the UK FCDO Steering Committee. Good evening, Rosa.
Good evening, Yehuda. I sound more impressive than I am.
If any of you have questions for Rosa throughout this webinar, for anything that she says or anything that we discuss, and we don't answer your question, then please do write your question in the Q&A section, which should be at the bottom of your screen. At any point during the webinar and the latter part of this webinar, I will select some of the questions and read them out for Rosa, dependent on time. So thank you for joining us, Rosa. Really appreciate it. I know how busy you are. I think you said you were in Germany this week, and you were messaging me this morning that you were on France 24 early in the morning. So we really appreciate that you're able to find the time for us and for our audience. In the last 4 or 5 weeks since the horrific massacres on 7th of October and the subsequent war, the terms international law, human rights, humanitarian pathways, humanitarian laws, ceasefires, they've been thrown around. And I think a lot of people are either pretending to know or are just sort of not sure where to turn. And they're just hearing the politicians throw out these words. So I was hoping that you could first explain to us, when politicians are talking about international law, what do they mean?
Thanks, Yehuda, and thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you. International law is a body of law that really developed to govern relationships between states. So we have international shipping law, we have laws on international mail, we have international economic law. But what they're talking about here at the moment is public international law relating to war. So they're talking about the law of armed conflict. They're talking about the law that relates to civilians during those armed conflicts. That's international humanitarian law. They're talking about human rights, which apply in peacetime as well as wartime, and they apply to any person who's been governed over by a country. So when there were soldiers from the UK in Iraq, the UK laws on human rights actually governed over anyone that was under their effective authority and control. So we're really talking about a particular area of law as it applies to armed conflict, but we're also hearing other laws relating to international criminal law. So we're hearing words like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and laws relating to statehood. So things around self-determination, or what people are calling resistance or struggle, which there is a right to do that, just not a violent right to do that. And I think one of the big issues that we're hearing from politicians, from the media, from people on the street, even sometimes from international lawyers, is people using these words in a wrong way, and then undermining what those words actually mean.
So when we're talking about international law, a lot of it has been, I think, in terms of civilians getting killed. Since the start of the war, the Hamas health ministry claimed that over 10,000 people have been killed. Again, we're not entirely sure how many of those are terrorists. The IDF has suggested that over 3,000, but again, we're not sure if that's part of the total number of civilians that Hamas claim to have been killed. What does international law say about civilians getting killed in acts of war which are deemed legitimate?
Okay, so let's take one step back from that. Let's just make very clear that there is never an excuse for what happened on the 7th of October. And I'd like to take this step back and just to make it really clear, because I'm hearing some international lawyers, some commentators talk about some form of excuse or justification under decolonization or right to resist. There is no excuse for any of the atrocities, which I'm not going to name because we all know them. The subsequent actions after the 7th of October fall under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is the right to self-defense. So countries can't act in an aggressive manner, right, in a violent way, towards another country or to a non-state actor. And Hamas is a non-state actor, and Al-Qassam brigades certainly are a non-state actor, unless it's to do with self-defense. And it's very clear, and it was made very clear from many countries around the world, not just sort of EU allies or the United States, that Israel has this right to self-defense after October the 7th. So then what comes into question, and what you're asking, is how far does that right go, right? What are legitimate acts of war and of self-defense, and what might be considered unlawful or illegitimate acts? I'm not a military specialist, you're not a military specialist, and even my colleagues and friends who have been military specialists say that urban armed conflict is the most difficult armed conflict in the world. It's the bloodiest armed conflict, and the tactics used are the most difficult to unpack in terms of law and in terms of practicality. So I just want to start with the caveat that I'm not a military specialist, and I really disagree with anyone that's not an expert talking about things they're not experts on. Where it comes to self-defense, there is a very key, and laws of war generally, there's a very key principle around international humanitarian law. Countries may never intentionally target civilians. There is no justification. Even if another country or non-state actor like Hamas did target intentionally civilians, you cannot do a quid pro quo. So that's the starting point. And if we take out the noise of Twitter and we take out the noise of people on the street who are chanting songs that they don't actually know what they mean when you ask them where the river is or the sea is and they don't know. But if you're talking about the people who do understand what's going on, there are very few accusations that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians. However, civilians are humans, and civilian infrastructure or property is different. And that's where it becomes really complicated around civilian loss of life. Because what do you do where you've got this area where you've got a civilian infrastructure on the top layer and you've got tunnels and command centers on the bottom layer? What do you do where you've got civilian property with civilians living in it? And in order to target, as a legitimate act of war, the tunnels underneath, it will be targeting those areas. So I think that's the question you're asking me, but I'm just checking.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen people throwing out these terms of proportionality, and I've been going around to schools and been questioned by lots of students when I go to non-Jewish schools saying, well, so many people are dying, and it's appalling But I try to point it out that I think many young people kind of see it as some sort of video game. They have that sort of, you know, you make a mistake, you should be able to start again, you know, and war isn't that way. And I wonder whether the understanding of how war works is something that we've forgotten, because we've been quite comfortable in the last 50, 60 years of not having such huge wars. And I wonder if that's something that has been lost in it. What do you think when you see people talk about international that way?
On Tuesday night, I was talking to a colleague that I've known for many years in Germany. He's not German, and he was playing the numbers game. And he was saying to me, but this number of people is claimed to have died. Which also, as you say, we don't know numbers, right? People are still identifying the bodies in Israel from October the 7th. Okay, so, but even if we're taking numbers as an approximate, so this number, and I reminded him of the law of proportionality isn't proportionate numbers of people dying, right? If we're talking about proportionality in terms of numbers, no one claims, people might claim that the bombing of Dresden was a war crime, but no one claims it was disproportionate the number of Germans and their allies that died in order to defeat the evil of Nazi Germany. We're talking about proportionality. People don't claim that the numbers of people that died in Raqqa and Mosul to root out ISIS is disproportionate. There will always be civilians whose lives may have been saved had war tactics been implemented in a different way. But proportionality is not about how many buildings are destroyed. It's the proportionality to the aim. And the aim here has been very clearly set out by the parts of the Israeli government who I am willing to listen to, because let's be clear, there are parts of the Israeli government who have said things and done things, we can name them, but we all know who they are, which do go against international law, right? Talking about wanting to destroy an entire population goes against international law, but thank God it's a very small proportion. But the aim here is very clear. The self-defense has to be to an imminent or ongoing threat. And there is an imminent or ongoing threat from a group who has in its charter the destruction of Israel, the destruction of the Jews' right to self-determination, and the destruction of Jews themselves. That is a genocidal aim. And at this point, is it proportionate to go and root out those people? Yes. I'm talking about the Al-Qassam brigades in particular. There's questions about how much Hamas is or isn't the Al-Qassam brigade. So if we just keep it really narrow, the ways in which it's being done is where the questions always happen. And what we saw with the supposed bombing of a hospital that turned out to be a missile from Hamas that landed in a car park is that investigations into war crimes always need to happen over a period of time and not through social media. But the proportionality principle that we're hearing all of the time is not proportion to the atrocities that happened on October the 7th or the ongoing atrocities of the holding of hostages without any access to medical aid or release or to the Red Cross. We're talking about proportionality to the aim of ending a genocidal group of people that are seeking to destroy Israel.
So just on that term of proportionality, because I think many of our audience here may have felt this, and I've seen this in the media quite a bit, and the question that I think many Jewish people feel is that this topic of proportionality seems to only be brought up when it comes to conflicts involving Israel. In your experience, do you think that's fair? Do you think that it's sort of almost a double standard? It's not talked about in other conflicts as much? And do you think that that's a fair argument as to why people are pointing out?
So this is a difficult one, because I spend my life doing, and I'm paid to do, work around the world that looks at human rights abuses and humanitarian law. And with most groups of people, they feel the same way. So at the moment, there is a genocide being perpetrated by the Janjaweed, who are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, the political Islamist parts like Hezbollah and Hamas in Darfur. And that genocide was ongoing nearly 20 years ago. It died down, it started up again. And people I know from Sudan or who are seized of the issue in Sudan will often feel that there's disproportionate attention or not enough attention to their conflict. And then I have something similar with the work I do in Haiti, and the way that Haiti feels that there's too much international intervention in Haiti. And why is the world always intervening and not trusting the Haitians and telling the Haitians what to do? And this is an ongoing theme because we care about ourselves, our families, our communities, and the things that matter to us geographically, politically, not because we don't care about elsewhere, but because we only have so much room in our lives and in our hearts to care about things. And it starts at home and with our families and with our friends and our communities. I think that a lot of the discussion around disproportionality was probably different in our parents' generations and certainly our grandparents. Certainly we can look at the Guardian newspaper and how it changed from its view of Israel in 1948 to its view of Israel now. And that's often to do with the sort of legacy of colonialism in Europe. I don't mean colonialism in Israel, but this legacy of colonialism in Europe where they think that because a country has military might, that means that there's no existential threat to it. And it's something that I've heard from colleagues who've checked in with me as a Jew and checked in with me as someone who has family and friends in Israel, but who still see Israel as the military might or see America as a military might. They don't quite realize the change in the world and that the rise of Iran, Russia, and China is a grave threat because they still live in a kind of Cold War era, right? And it's a generational thing as well. But no, I don't think that there is different attention to the way Israel's acting. What I think is different is that from Australia through to England, from Uruguay through to Uganda, this conflict is always foregrounded. And it's what I tell people about anti-Semitism, that it's not always just hating Jews, it's othering Jews. It's making Jews special and different. When we talk about Jews are so cultured or so rich, we're not so cultured or so rich. Jews aren't so great or so terrible. We're not othered, we're just human beings. And there is an othering of Israel that has gone on throughout the Cold War and continued in this modern global era. And that othering is a phenomenon that you don't really see elsewhere.
Israel is routinely accused of war crimes, but not a lot of the time we actually see the specifics of what those crimes may be. Based on your knowledge and what you've seen so far, what war crimes do you think Israel are being accused of committing? And do you think any of them actually hold any weight? Or potentially, my second part of my question is, do you think that Israel, with its current ground offensive, potentially could get itself into kind of a sticky situation where it may very likely commit war crimes?
Okay, so again, I'm not a military person or a military expert. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw fairly swift evidence of war crimes. War crimes are international crimes committed during war times that go beyond the individual level. So mass rape of a population in order to subjugate or oppress them, right? That would be an example of a war crime. That level of war crime that that happened in Sierra Leone with the use of child soldiers, with the way that people had their limbs chopped off as part of an ongoing effort to oppress a population, is neither evidence nor, in my belief, ongoing in the way that Israel conducts its military operations. And when people talk about war crimes, it invokes in all of us this ideas of the war crimes we saw. For me, I was 10 years old. My first awakening to international law was the war in Yugoslavia, right? For other people, it might have been Rwanda. For other people, it might have been earlier in Afghanistan or Vietnam or all places where there was ongoing and very obvious evidence of these types of crimes that are so heinous, that hit us in a way that we cannot understand how men, and it's predominantly men, behave in this way in a war when they wouldn't necessarily behave in that way in peacetime. I don't see any evidence of that, not even the social media kind of evidence that's being put forward to try and justify the kind of demonstrations that we're seeing across Europe. Has Israel committed war crimes? I don't know. And if I said to you, no, they haven't, I'd be lying because I don't know. It will only be after the war that we will know, because sometimes individuals act in a way that the army doesn't want them to, or that the country doesn't want them to. Sometimes atrocities are committed for reasons that we don't know because we've never stood there in the shoes of a soldier in these situations. But the type of war crimes, or what this term war crimes evokes in people, the use of this term almost as polemic, I have not seen any evidence of. What I have seen evidence of is destruction of property, right? But it may be for proportionate and legitimate aims. What I have seen evidence of is a mass movement of a population, right, for legitimate and lawful purposes. Do these amount to war crimes? At the moment, there is no evidence to show that they do. Does that mean that after an investigation later on, there's discussion of white phosphorus being used? White phosphorus being used in certain settings is not a war crime, because it can be used in a legitimate way in open areas to light up for soldiers to go in. If white phosphorus is used to burn the skin of people intentionally, then it would be a war crime. So it's certainly not for me to determine that. But if we're thinking war crimes like what happened in Bucha in Ukraine, no, I've seen no evidence of that.
And when it comes to, trialing for war crimes, I think I'm quite ignorant of this myself. I don't know many of the audience as well. Let's say Israel and Hamas, who we know every single rocket that's fired over is a war crime. We know that many of the acts on the 7th of October themselves are war crimes, and they're continually themselves. What happens? Do they drag in a couple of soldiers? Do they drag in the general, the prime minister? When it comes to Israel, who is found guilty? When it comes to Hamas, does it mean that Yahya Sinwar is responsible, Ismail Haniyeh, all the way over in Turkey or Qatar, wherever he is? Where does the buck stop? And when it comes to investigating and trialing for war crimes?
It's a really difficult one. So international criminal law really started with Nazi Germany, with the trials in Nuremberg, with genocide, which was coined by a Jew, this idea of intentionally destroying whole or in part of people because of their race or their religion and so on. They are the highest levels of crime, and the people you hold responsible are those who ordered them to happen. So with Hamas, it is clear that what happened on the 7th of October was a genocidal act. It was aimed to destroy in whole or in part a group of people based on their religion. It is clear because they filmed themselves doing it. It is clear because of the evidence that they themselves have provided. But what happens to them? So the people that ordered it, the people most responsible, could be held to account in either an international criminal court or a tribunal, as Slobodan Milosevic, right? That type of person could be held to account. But what happens in reality? We know what happens in reality. We know what the legitimate and proportionate warfare aim is here. What about those who acted as part of it? Well, they don't get tried in the same way, because the entire purpose of having these sort of crimes that are so awful that they're international crimes is also that the people that ordered them, even if they didn't carry them out themselves, are those who are most responsible. When it comes to Israel, if there is evidence of war crimes, it would be the people who ordered them to be carried out, whether it's through the government or whether it's through the military. And again, we've seen it, that there are countries where Israeli officials have landed and had to get back on the plane because there's fear that they might be arrested.
Yeah.
And for potential war crimes or crimes against humanity. And they didn't want to test that system to see what would happen, because those arrests may be legitimate and they might be arrested and held to account, or it might be a political move. What happens at the end of this? I don't think any of us know. This has changed the entire landscape, the entire world. And I don't think that, and I said this earlier on France 24, I don't think that Israel is looking beyond rooting out Hamas and getting back the hostages. And I don't, because they asked me why, what happens in terms of international criminal law? Why isn't Israel pursuing Hamas through the ICC? And I said, because they're trying to get back the hostages. So I think there is a practical reality that lawyers can talk at a law level from outside of a country without remembering the people who are trying to be saved.
Thank you. I mean, one of the big talking points, and I can see actually someone has actually asked that question, Sharon, thank you, is this question about this siege, this cutting off of fuel, water, electricity. I mean, Keir Starmer got into a bit of trouble recently by saying that it was legitimate in a way. He said it was legitimate. He seemed to double down on it in some way, back down from it a little bit. Israel has, at the very early stages, cut off water, which we understand is at peak it was 10%, maybe 7% on average of the water from Israel provided. Electricity grids cut off for various periods of time. Internet cut off. Fuel cut off from Israel into Gaza itself. And people are claiming that it's collective punishment. So Volker Turk, UN Commissioner for Human Rights, said, I think last night maybe, or a couple of nights ago, both Israel and Hamas committed war crimes. He specifically, pointed out Israel's collective punishment of Palestinians as an example. So, what Israel has done, is it, in your mind, legitimate from what you've seen? And could there, what this idea of collective punishment, could that hold any weight in how Israel has acted in this method?
So a siege in and of itself is not necessarily unlawful in times of war. And again, it comes down to motive and intent and how it's carried out. So if you lay siege to a city or to a place in order to root out armed combatants, then it's part of warfare. And I say this with my hands up as someone that really hates war, just hates war, and hates the idea of warfare, and hates the idea that there are laws of warfare and rules of engagement and video games and everything else to do with war. The idea of a siege in order to hold a population to ransom, collective punishment, or what one of the two worst people in the government talked about starving the citizens until the hostages are released, that is clearly unlawful. But you can't ascribe the motives of the military to someone like Ben Gvir, right? They're not in charge of the military. And their polemic doesn't help these things, because when those types of government members talk about starving a population, that's not necessarily why the military is laying a siege. So the starting point is that Israel has supplied various things to Gaza, but Gaza also has supplies through the Rafah crossing and through the tunnels, illegally or not illegally, it's up to Egypt about the tunnels that come out of the Rafah crossing, for many, many years. Israel is not under any international law obligation to continue to supply those things during a time of war, those things, whether it's water or electricity or mobile phone coverage. At the same time, we saw at the beginning of the war that Israel bombed the Rafah crossing to make clear, like Israel has bombed in Syria, to make clear that Iran can't just ship weapons into Syria to be brought to Hamas to attack Israel, right? It bombed the Rafah crossing to make clear that fuel supplies and other supplies that were going directly to Hamas and to the Al-Qassam brigades would not be coming through. The Rafah crossing is controlled, as you know, by Egypt since the withdrawal from Gush Katif, at times with some EU help. And Egypt has very much been in control of opening or not opening it, and very often not telling Gazans when it might be open or when it might not be. It's a very strange border and crossing in that way. Egypt, for its own reasons, and I'm not a political scientist and I'm not going to go into it, but for its own reasons did not open the borders. But what Israel was saying wasn't that Egypt couldn't open the borders to allow Gazans out, but it didn't want supplies going in, trucks going in that have fuel that might go to Hamas and Al-Qassam, but also weapons or people that might be going in. And the point where that happened was the discussion of how to monitor what was going in. Now, just to be very clear, Hamas has plenty of supplies of fuel and food and water that it is keeping away from its civilian population. Okay, the siege of Gaza is not what is causing a lack of fuel or a lack of food or a lack of water. At the same time, that doesn't mean in international law that Israel can prevent legitimate supplies of aid coming in, which is why we've seen some aid trucks coming in, including the strange one that we all saw, including friends of mine who watch Arabic language TV channels of Russians sending outdated food that couldn't be eaten at all in one of the few aid trucks that was allowed in. There was just a great uproar across the board over that one. But the siege itself is not necessarily unlawful. It's about the intent and how it's carried out.
I mentioned Volker Turk, who is UN Commissioner for Human Rights, and I want to talk to you about the UN, which I think is like your specialty. In Israel, there's a very, very negative attitude towards the UN. In Ivrit, they have a term called Shmum, which roughly translated into English is UN whatever kind of thing, to be polite. What's really, for anyone who might be a bit ignorant about nowadays, what's the point of the UN? Are they effective? Is Israel's attitude generally of Shmum, a sensible one, considering that the UN is so crucial to the creation of the modern state of Israel? The attitude that Israel has now, we have the ambassador for Israel in the UN, and he's been very, very hostile. He's called for Antonio Guterres' resignation, which we'll get to him in a bit. But what is the role of the UN in this? As some are questioning, what is the point of the UN, and are they effective? And is Israel's attitude towards them sensible, or should they rethink it?
I'm smiling at you, Yehuda, because you and I have had this conversation many times, just not on a webinar, and it's like a Friday night dinner table in my house. What's the point of the UN? What is the UN? The UN is many things, actually. It's 193 member states who pay the fees of the UN and are the bosses of the UN and sit at the UN. It's also the UN Secretariat, which originally was created to be 400 people and is now hundreds of thousands of people who run all the programs on the ground, things like UNICEF or the High Commission for Refugees or the UN Food Programme or the UN Drugs Agency and many more. The UN is also the bodies in which these member states sit, like the Security Council and the Human Rights Council. So I don't really know where to start with what the UN is right now in Israel and Gaza, but I'll say what I said to you a little bit earlier today. The only part of the UN that has teeth to do anything about an armed conflict or a war is the Security Council. The UN was set up to prevent another world war, right? It was set up because the League of Nations, after the First World War, failed and we had a Second World War. And the countries who are allied against Nazi Germany said, if we're going to be preventing another world war, we want to be in charge of making sure that happens. So Russia, China, France, Britain, and the United States. We're going to sit on this Security Council. And if we see a threat to international peace or security, we're going to have this extra say over what happens. And because the Security Council is the only part of the UN with teeth to have embargoes or no-fly zones or sanctions or set up peacekeeping operations or do anything with actual enforcement teeth, the rest of the UN feels impotent where it comes to Israel and Gaza, where it comes to Syria, where it comes to China and Taiwan, where it comes to any place where the UN Security Council doesn't enforce peace and security. And there has been decades of UN bodies and UN actors feeling impotent because the Security Council will not come to a decision about how to enforce a two-state solution. We have the 1947 partition plan. Again, I was told this week in Germany, not by a German colleague, I stress, that Israel has never faced an existential war because it has America on its side. And when I said, but what about 1948? They said, Israel was always going to survive, right? That's the narrative that plays out because of America's support of Israel's right to exist. Because the Security Council has never been able to get through anything on a two-state solution, because anything that might talk about Israel's right to exist gets vetoed by Russia, and anything that might talk to Israel about needing to, I don't mean negotiate with Hamas, God forbid, right? Because it's not going to happen, look at their charter, but I'm talking about previously, right? America and the UK and sometimes France has stood up for Israel. So the rest of the UN gets louder and louder during times of war because it knows it's impotent to do anything. And one of the things I I struggle to express on a Friday night, it's dinner and tired, is that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Secretary General, his job is the head of the civil service for the UN. He has no power to do anything. UNICEF or any other UN place, they get louder and louder because they can't do anything to force the Security Council's hand. And so it's actually a sign of their frustration and impotence rather than a sign of any strength on their part. You don't look convinced, Yehuda. You never do.
No, I mean, I think what many Jews and supporters of Israel look at the UN and they just see all these resolutions, and a disproportionate number of resolutions are condemning Israel every year. And you've got Israel, which is much higher on the democracy index compared to countries like Iran, Syria, North Korea, etc. And they barely get any sort of resolutions against it. So I think the attitude towards the UN is incredibly negative. And when you talk about the Security Council, and they're all vetoing each other, the question for many people is, what's the point? But I think something I'd like to ask you as well is, you mentioned Human Rights Council before. So just very, very briefly, could you explain the difference between the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council? And also, people were getting very upset about Iran heading the Human Rights Council. Just to clarify to people.
Social forum. Okay, so
what does that mean, really? And what does that affect?
The UN have three purposes. One is to maintain international peace and security. One is development. So sort of countries that are lesser developed, helping them to become more developed. Earlier, it was decolonization, essentially. And also human rights, to create a human rights project, because what the Nazis did to German citizens was not unlawful. They could do anything they wanted to German Jews, to German Roma, to disabled Germans, gay Germans, communist Germans. So to create this system of human rights. The Security Council has the most teeth, because the most enforcement powers and the most money, because without international peace and security, the entire project fails. And it's not just talking about international peace and security in terms of world wars. It's talking about peace and security between states, or even within states, or even dealing with Boko Haram or the Houthis or the Janjaweed or Hezbollah or any other threat to peace and security. The Human Rights Council has 15 members, 5 of whom, the 5 countries I said before, Britain, France, China, Russia, and the United States, are permanent members, and they can veto any action that the Security Council proposes to take. And the other 10 members are elected, and they're there. I mean, they do some work. You need their votes if you want to pass something that isn't vetoed. But they're there for 2 years, and they come and they go. The Human Rights Council, which sits in Geneva, is very much a sort of poor relation of peace and security or development. Development happens at the General Assembly, it happens elsewhere. But the Human Rights, very much, the Human Rights Council is a political body. It has 47 members, they're elected, and they move on after 3 years. And like with all UN bodies, it represents all of the geographies of the world. In order for it to function, it has to have all states be able to stand for election, because otherwise states would say, well, it's only Western European countries that are sitting there, why should we listen to it? Last year, Russia was suspended from the Human Rights Council. The last time a state had been suspended from the Human Rights Council was Libya, under, similar circumstances. Generally, no matter how bad a country's human rights abuses are, it can stand for election. Iran is currently about to chair the Social Forum, which is a little part of the Human Rights Council where member states meet with civil society. Now, of course, that's laughable, given what Iran does to civil society generally, and given the women and girls that are being killed and butchered for taking off their hijabs. But what happens within communities like ours is that we see that Iran has got this kind of seat of what's perceived as power, but for people that understand the UN, recognize it's a nothing position. One state has to take it. Iran will be doing it for political reasons because of its relationship with civil society currently. But it makes absolutely no difference to anyone's lives other than yet again being a part of the UN that isn't doing its job properly, because if we really cared about civil society, we wouldn't want Iran to be chairing the forum where civil society meets member states. It's there are some really important things that come out from the UN human rights world to do with Israel. This is not one of them.
Talking about the head of UN, the General Secretary, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he made some comments about the 7th of October. I think last week, the week before, he basically said that the attacks did not happen in a vacuum. And the Israeli delegation responded very poorly to it. They were very upset. We had the Israeli delegation who put on yellow stars, which was very controversial. I think in the Jewish community as well, it's caused much divide. I've seen someone ask a question about the reaction from Israel towards Antonio Guterres, but what is his role? Do you think is he effective in his current role, and do you think his comments were wise, and do you think you might regret them?
The UN Secretary General is a figurehead who is appointed, again, geographic representation. You sometimes have an African, sometimes an Asian, sometimes an Eastern European, and so on. He's appointed to be the head of the civil service. What he said was an absolute outrage. I looked it up. I looked up what the UN Secretary General said at the time, not him, it was the previous one, after 9/11. There was no talk about things happening in a vacuum. I looked up after what happened in the Manchester Arena and 7/7 bombings. I looked up after terrorist events that happened across Nigeria by Boko Haram. There is no moral equivalence, full stop. So I may be far more to the left than you, Yehuda, as you know. And I may understand more about the UN and what matters or what doesn't.
Yeah.
But that statement was trying to contextualize or provide a moral equivalence to the atrocities that we all know about, that I don't want to name because I'm sick of having to name them in my work world to people and remind them of these atrocities. The words that he used delegitimized the UN to people within Israel who already are skeptical of the UN. And if we have time, we can talk about UNRWA if you'd like to. But what he also did was send a message to the very many people and states out there who don't have a particular position on Israel-Palestine. I've sat in so many UN human rights meetings where states or individuals have said, could we stop talking about Israel and Palestine because there are other places that need discussion? It takes the attention away from other atrocities and abuses and situations that are going on. There's a finite amount of time and resources. What it said to them was that the Secretary General was differentiating between this and every other act of terrorism that happened. I don't know what their take home is from that. But again, I go back to what I said earlier. Anti-Semitism is treating Jews differently or othered. It's treating Israel as though it's not a nation state like any other. And what he said, if you do a comparison with how he or his predecessors have talked about other terrorist atrocities, is anti-Semitic because it's treating the Jewish victims of terrorism as different to other victims.
And so on that, because I can see someone's asked that question as well, saying, do you think that Israel's reaction, calling for his resignation, is fair? Do you think now you're suggesting that his comments are anti-Semitic, do delegitimize the UN in a way? Do you think that actually is something that he should consider his position?
You and I are too young to remember the 1970s and the resolutions that said Zionism is racism, right? You and I are too young to remember our lived experience, although we could read the books and you're more of a historian than I am, about the delegitimization of the UN to anyone in Israel who takes a Zionist position. I don't just mean Jewish Israelis, I mean Bedouin, Druze, Christians, anyone else, or anyone outside of Israel. This Secretary General used to be the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for refugees. He used to be head of the UN High Commission for Refugees. I think his words were ill-judged. I think the fact that he offered a retraction or a kind of explanation says that his words were ill-judged. I don't know that the UN could have much of a worse reputation in Israel than it does. And my friends and family who live in Israel, I'm always trying to explain why I think that the UN is the best possible thing we could have for the world, because if we disbanded it now, we could never create anything that all countries would sign up to. But I think this made it a hell of a lot worse for any UN people to try and function in Israel. Do I think Israel overreacted? The UN is created in its charter on the foundation is the sovereign equality of states. States have sovereignty over their own territory. Israel's reaction was to say, we're not giving visas to UN people to come in. I, who work with, adjacent to, and fundamentally believe in the UN, don't think that that was an overreaction.
Okay. We might get to UNRWA because I want to give time for some questions, but actually this is something else that we discussed earlier. The Red Cross. I mean, I'm actually going to put it in simple, what is going on? We know there was a protest out there outside the Red Cross headquarters today in central London. You know, the job of the Red Cross, from what we understand, is that they're meant to go and check on the hostages. We understand at least 240, probably more. Why have we not heard anything from the Red Cross? Do you think they're trying hard enough? Are Hamas just very, very difficult? Is that the simple solution? But really, what is going on with the Red Cross, and do you think that they should be doing better?
So I'm not an expert on the Red Cross or on civil society organizations working in humanitarian areas. But we know about the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, that they were created, going back to your first question about international humanitarian law. It's there to protect civilians or non-combatants or prisoners of war in times of war, to protect certain rights. The Red Cross's role is to ensure access to medical care, knowledge to families, and ultimately release, where possible, of the kidnapped, hostages, or prisoners of war. We're talking about babies. They failed. They failed, I don't know why, I'm not an expert on them, but they failed in their foundational purpose. And it's an outrage, and I use that word really carefully, it's an outrage that there hasn't been international pressure on them, given that there are chapters and groups of the Red Cross and Red Crescent across the world.
I mean, this is the thing that I think is most frustrating and angering for many, is that, you know, the mass kidnapping of Israelis is one of the worst, I think, in recent times. I think you echo what happened with Boko Haram when they kidnapped all those girls. And do you think there's just like too many for the Red Cross potentially, that it's just beyond their capacity potentially?
Again, it's not my expertise why they're not acting. What I can tell you is something that is within my expertise, and I think we all need to understand. People working in Gaza are no different to people living as civilians in Gaza. They are working under the governance of a terrorist organization that has at its disposal the weapons and the capabilities that we ascribe to some of the gangs in Colombia that have taken over from the state, or to Hezbollah, or to all sorts of other places. I am not legitimizing, justifying, or excusing anyone that joins in the terrorist atrocities. I am reminding us who live in liberal democracies that the ability to speak out or to hold to account our government is completely different. If you are working for the Red Cross or for the local library, right now in Putin's Russia, you're in a terrible position. And that is nothing near what's going on in Gaza. That is not to say that they are doing their jobs, because we can see from all the reports about the UNRWA teachers, from all the reports about the medical staff, from the few whistleblowers, we can see what they're operating under. We can see that the minute that the IDF gets control of what someone called to me on France 24, the Edgware Road, because apparently that road from Gaza City down to the south is the length of the Edgware Road, right?
I walk that road. It's a schlep, but it's not terrible.
It's a schlep, but the minute the IDF gets in control of it, the civilians flee because they're safe to, because they're not going to be fired on by Hamas. The Red Cross has failed, not just the Red Cross in Gaza, because actually the job of the Red Cross around the world is to support those in Gaza to be able to go and find the hostages and at least provide the medical care, because that's the foundational principle of the Red Cross. It is an outrage. It is an outrage that I probably have only seen or heard about in terms of ISIS, but we saw how quickly the world got rid of ISIS. So then the question is, why is the world not quickly supporting the getting rid of the Al-Qassam brigades?
Thank you. I mean, I can see someone's in the question section has said that, I assume you were at the protest today, whoever, they're anonymous, they said that the Red Cross didn't give a statement today to those who protested outside, which is very disappointing.
And a lot of the time, having worked with civil society around the world, a lot of the time it's because the first principle that they have is to take care of their staff. And then the question becomes, why have we globally allowed a situation where a Red Cross chapter in the UK is so scared for its staff in Gaza?
I'm going to point to questions now from our audience, with whatever time we have now. So I've seen some of the questions. I think you've answered some of them, so I apologise if I don't read it out. I do think that Rosa has answered some of these questions. The one I've got here is anonymous. What do you say to the claim that Gaza is an open-air prison? In a sense, is this true, as they can't get out their borders, they don't have an airport, and the sea is tightly controlled by Israel and Egypt, in brackets for good reasons, of course. Well, just very quickly, what do you have to say about that statement, the reference of it being an open-air prison?
So again, it's polemic, right? Open air prison. So let's talk about occupation, because that's a legal term. Since the withdrawal from Gush Katif, Israel has not occupied Gaza, because occupation in international law talks about governing over the people, controlling their basic goods and necessities. We know that Israel provides some fuel, some water, about 7 to 10% of the water in Gaza. It does control its airspace and its seas. Egypt controls another border. So was there an occupation prior to 7th of October? No. There wasn't an occupation under international law. An open-air prison? No, because there are ways out, like the Rafah crossing. So it's no more an open-air prison because of Israel than Egypt, in terms of, like, if we're using that language instead of occupation. Will there be an occupation now? Could we see it as an occupation now legally? Certainly what's coming out of Gaza City could start to be seen as an occupation, not necessarily governance, but effective authority and control. Will it be for legitimate reasons? Yes. Proportionate? Yes. How long could it last for those reasons? Not sure. If we're looking at it from a moral or political stance as an open-air prison, then lots of questions have to be asked. Why does Egypt not open the borders? Why does Israel control the seas? You know, fishing is a huge industry, right? Yeah. What are the reasons for it? And again, it's not my expertise, and I'm not here for a Friday night dinner chat, so I'm going to leave it at that. It's not an occupation currently. It wasn't. But it certainly wasn't. It's a self-governing autonomous region that doesn't have the ability to operate as even an observer territory.
Okay, I mean, Friday night we could discuss whether it was really occupied in the first place. I've been reading a lot of interesting things about it, about the effect, who was controlling it, but we can do that another time. I've got a question here from Stephen. On the 17th of October, several eminent British Jewish lawyers, including Professor Philip Casey, I think now, published a letter in the Financial Times in which they stated there are some aspects of Israel's response that already cause significant concern. Do you think their concerns were unwarranted and reflected effective understanding of international law?
Okay, so let me go back to my point that I hate war. I hate war.
I think most of us do.
I hate guns, I hate militaries, and I figure that even if we got rid of them all, men and boys, and sometimes girls, but mostly men and boys, the way they're socialized would fight with sticks. But I hate war. And I believe that in every war, there is some wrong done. Yeah, that I believe that, well, I despise Netanyahu not as much as one member of my family who won't travel to Israel while he's in power. And some of the elected people, and certainly what's going on in the West Bank right now, I abhor.
Yeah.
Okay. There have been many open letters, many letters to the Financial Times, many letters to the Wall Street Journals. Everyone thinks, and they are much more eminent. Philippe Stand's much more eminent lawyer than me. No one knows what is really going on in terms of what the IDF is doing in Gaza. But what we do know is that hundreds of thousands, if not, nearly 2 million civilians, probably 1.5 million, because we've got to think that many of these are members of the Al-Qassam Brigade, have gone to safety or relative safety to the point that Hamas yesterday criticized UNRWA for taking them into South Gaza and said that UNRWA was forcibly displacing them because they didn't want UNRWA to be feeding them or sheltering them or providing education or anything else, because these were essentially human shields for them before. At the same time, I'm an international lawyer and I'm taking my politics and my beliefs out of this, my personal beliefs. We know that within war, bad things happen. And I don't just mean bad things happen inadvertently. We know atrocities happen also. Yeah. We will not know until after this war. What we have categorically known throughout this, including the IDF taking Sky News in, is that there is no mass rape or genocide or stealing of washing machines or everything else that we saw immediately from the Russian invasion in Ukraine or from invasions into Somalia and Sudan and everything else, the looting and the pillaging and everything else. That doesn't mean that any one unnecessary civilian death is not one civilian death too many, but I just don't think there can be any whataboutery or comparison with other wars that we've seen going on over the last 10 years.
Thanks. We've got a lot of good questions, I hope you don't mind. Danielle's got a good question here within your areas of expertise. A couple of weeks ago, the IDF presented a very bold claim through their intelligence that the Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza is on top of the top Hamas Al-Qassam military base. They released a bit of graphics, they got a lot of criticism for it, but that's their big claim, is why they're surrounding Al-Shifa hospital at the moment. Danielle's question is, they're going to target it. What's the maximum level of destruction, if any, at all, to the Al-Shifa hospital and potentially damage to civilian life could be seen while still remaining lawful in some ways, considering that if Israel's claims are correct, that this is the top hub. What does that mean?
Even if Israel's claims are correct, right? Even if there is a military command under the Al-Shifa hospital, at the end of the day, civilians are civilians. Now, there might be civilian human shields who are there voluntarily. And there's a slight question about, do they remain civilians or do they become parties to the hostility? But if we're talking about the elderly, the infirm, the disabled, the young, right? If we're talking about people at gunpoint, they are human shields and they remain civilians. When I said at the beginning that there is never any justification for intentionally targeting civilians, there is never any justification for intentionally targeting civilians. So the United Arab Emirates at the moment is building a field hospital in order to try and evacuate, right? I mean, we can leave the politics out about UAE and Saudi Arabia and every other reason why they are. Because there is never a justification for intentionally targeting civilians. And I take us back to what we never learned in school in Britain about the bombing of Dresden and the intentional targeting of civilians. It's never okay. So sometimes civilians will die and they're not being intentionally targeted. But if there is knowledge that there are civilians there and their place is targeted anyway, that becomes a major issue and potentially a war crime and not okay. So it goes back to me not being a military expert and not knowing how to deal with tunnels. We've certainly seen tunnels being collapsed and then entire tower blocks falling down. And there will be civilians in there who have died, right? Who have died. These are people with lives and hopes and dreams. Can you say that was intentionally targeted? Probably not if they were collapsing tunnels. But to bomb a hospital where you know civilians are there because there's a command center under, I'm an international lawyer. It's not okay.
Thank you. I think it's important that people get that clarification because it's been such a hot point, and it seems to be the bullseye of the operation in the north. I've got a question here from Osoria. Sorry, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Don't you think it would be somehow important to make the world and the Israeli population understand better and more clearly that the statehood of modern Israel was granted by the UN? So Israel happened with UN support. Isn't it something that needs to be emphasized much more? Maybe also emphasized to the UN itself. Does it important people of all sides will not be aware of this, at least not sufficiently?
It's such a great question. And I'm going to step outside of my lawyer hat for now, just for 1 second to answer this. If we took anti-Semitism out the equation, why do you think the UN cares so much about Israel and Palestine? It's the only two countries that the UN created, and this has been an epic failure. And if I take myself out of thinking about Israel, anti-Semitism, and everything else, there is another reason why the UN is so involved and so impotent and so frustrated by Israel and Palestine.
Nice, short and sweet. Yes.
Right?
I've got a question here from Charlotte. How much do the people that count, that are relevant, agree with you, Rosa? I think the second half is that you paint a pretty reassuring picture, but should we allow that to give us a glimmer of hope when it comes to Ethan?
Hi, Charlotte. How much do the people that matter or that count agree with me? It depends what you mean by count, right? Or matter. Or I think there is far more awareness of the complexities and nuances within military advisors to NATO or the United States or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. I think there is far more awareness and complexity of the nuance within state missions to the United Nations. The bigger the state or the more money the state, the more advisors they have. Don't be fooled that what people say on the media, whether they are a spokesperson or not, what they say in the Security Council is what they're saying behind closed doors. I'm a lawyer who fundamentally believes that we have to take the ideas of law and bring them into the practical realities on the ground. And the power of diplomacy is far stronger than the power of taking people to court. I think amongst it's not empirical research, I don't know, I've not done it. Amongst the people I know, I think this has shaken so many people's worldviews on all sides and all levels. But I don't think that people talk in sound bites that walk the halls of power. And I don't know, I don't walk all the halls with them, but I think even the sound bites we're seeing about the marches about Palestine do not reflect the nuanced understanding that is going on these things. So I'm not sure I understood the purpose of your question, Charlotte, but if I did, it's this. What happened on the 7th of October has changed absolutely everything. Yeah. And we're going to move into a new world order as a result of it around Israel and Palestine, but more broadly around Saudi Arabia and Iran and all sorts of other things. But I don't think people that walk these halls of power are oblivious to it. I think it's working them up to it.
Thank you. I think I'll give one last, I see there's another question there, but I think it's about a different topic. So sorry, Stephen. Maybe another webinar, we can look into that topic, but that's on the other side of Israel. We're focusing more on the war with Hamas. Catherine has a response to your answer about the Al-Shifa hospital. And she says, well, your comments are saying that international law potentially gives Hamas a get out of jail free card by placing their headquarters underneath or in the hospital. they either force Israel to commit a war crime or Israel fails to defeat them. And that's something I was thinking about. This is Israel being put in this catch-22 situation, which is I think one of the biggest things is that Israel's boldest claim is not just to get the hostages out, is to eliminate Hamas. And the big question mark is, can you really do that?
Okay, so answering that one's easy. No, you can cut the head off the beast, but you can't eliminate it. We're seeing it with ISIS now.
Right.
Right? Like we're saying Israel wanted to get rid of Fatah, so now we've got Hamas. Before Fatah, it was a PLO and so on and so forth. Right? You can disable but not kill the beast.
Mm.
But the question around the Al-Shifa hospital, no, it doesn't give Hamas the get out of jail free card, because not everything in this war is on the shoulders of Israel. There are many actors involved. If these civilians are not taken out, and we can see very clearly that every time the fuel's about to run out, there's more fuel put into the Al-Shifa hospital. It's not because Hamas or the Al-Qassams care so much about the neonatal babies in there. It's because they need the hospital to be running and the refugees to be in there, let alone the people who are in there for medical treatment. And those refugees and people in there for medical treatment are civilians, right? So two things can be true at the same time. The field hospitals that are being erected, the other partners in this situation outside of Israel or Hamas, right? There is a responsibility on those also. And at some point, and we've seen it because we've seen the videos. At some point, the dogs go down. I mean, the literal German Shepherd dogs go down and do their jobs in the tunnels.
Mm.
If these hospitals are not fully evacuated, it doesn't get Hamas off the hook. It just means it takes longer for Israel to achieve its objectives. And it probably means more death of Israeli soldiers and probably more death of civilians in the surrounding areas.
Thank you. Really appreciate your incredible insight. I think we've had a number of webinars where, I think the experts are either not in this country, I think they're a bit, or for some people a different world. I think it's really comforting to know that we have an expert within our community here in the UK who's able to offer these wonderful insights. So I really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much for everyone's questions. I apologize if we didn't get around to your question. Maybe another time we do another webinar in the future. Please do continue to support us. We hope that these do get better. As I said at the beginning, we're here to support you in any kind of way possible. We wish protection and safety for all of the IDF soldiers currently serving, as well as all civilians caught in the crossfires of this current war. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.